What most people today think of when one is to mention a tank is an armored fighting vehicle much like this. But just over 100 years ago, this was not the case. Whilst the concept of a tank has been around for centuries, the First World War saw its first modern application on a large scale. The idea of the tank was to be a land battleship, used to break the stalemate of trench warfare by breaking through barbed wire, destroying machine gun nests, and climbing over trenches to make way for the infantry. The first tank to be used was the Mark I. Because of many issues with the tank, the Mark I's design was improved with the Mark IV. Although the shape did not change, there are some important differences. Firstly, the fuel tank was moved from the front of the vehicle to the back, as to make fuel ignition from a hit less likely. The capacity of the fuel tank was also increased to 70 gallons from 50. Secondly, the armor on the sides was increased to 12 mm. Small arms fire could sometimes penetrate the sides of a Mark I. The tail wheel was removed. This wheel was used on the Mark I to aid steering, when in fact the tank could steer just fine on its own, and more than anything the wheel got stuck in the mud. Some Mark I crews even abandoned their tanks when the wheel broke, believing the wheel was essential. The 6-pounder gun barrels were shortened as the Mark I's guns often got stuck in the mud. The sponsons on which the guns were held were given the ability to be pushed inside of a chassis for rail transportation, rather than having to be unbolted like on the Mark I. And finally, the decorative camouflage was not used anymore, as the mud covered up the paint so it could not be seen anyway. And those are the main differences. Both models still had a crew of 8, consisting of a commander who sat at the front next to the driver, 2 gunners, 2 loaders, and 2 gearmen who would operate the gears allowing the tank to turn. Conditions for these men were abysmal. Inside the Mark IV it was cramped, uncomfortable, noisy, harmful and hot, reaching 50 degrees Celsius at points. The tank was uncomfortable because it had no suspension, so it was a bumpy ride. Crew members would often bash their heads against the metal walls and ceilings. A solution for this was a leather helmet to cushion a bash to the head. However, these helmets looked an awful lot like the German Pickelhaube, so some crewmen getting out of the tank were shot by British soldiers by mistake, making the helmet very unpopular. There were only 2 seats in the tank, and they were at the front for the commander and driver. These were considered the best positions to be because cool air could get in through the vision ports. All other members of the crew had to stand. The tank was noisy because of its exposed engine. When the engine started, no crew member could speak to communicate as the engine was too loud. Commands were put forward by banging the tank with a metal item. This exposed engine was also the reason why the tank was harmful to be inside. Reports say that after 30 minutes of running, exhaust pipes became red with heat, and because of this sometimes would disconnect from the exterior pipe, letting fumes inside of the tank. Many crewmen had carbon monoxide poisoning from the fumes leaking inside, and would only realize when they exited and got some fresh air. The exposed engine is also the reason for the immense heat of the tank, along with it being made entirely from metal. Despite all of this, it was seen as better than the conditions outside the tank. The Mark IV was the first tank to be mass-produced. 1,220 were made during the war from May 1917 till its end in 1918. The tank, an experimental and new weapon, would prove itself as a part of warfare at the Battle of Cambrai. This was the first mass tank assault in history. 476 tanks were used. Created for each tank was a fascine, made of a bundle of sticks that would be used to fill deep trenches so that the tank could cross. A part of a German trench line was wider, dedicated to stopping tanks. This wooden fascine would only be used at Cambrai. The battlefield at Cambrai was untouched. There was not a major artillery bombardment, so the ground was stable for tanks to move, unlike previous battles such as the Battle of Passchendaele. The tank corps was to lead the attack, clearing the way for the infantry and cavalry to exploit. This is a diagram of a German trench line. The barbed wire was placed in a way so that it would direct British soldiers into the pillboxes equipped with machine guns. The tanks would break the barbed wire, making a safe passage for the infantry. The attack was a success for the tanks. Only 179 were lost out of the 476. However, the Cambrai operation itself was a failure, as the cavalry did not receive their orders to exploit the path the tanks had made. Despite this, the Battle of Cambrai proved that the tank was an effective weapon and had potential for the future of warfare. The flag of the Royal Tank Regiment was also created just before Cambrai, and was used to lead the tanks. Its colors represent the tank's struggle, from mud through blood and to the green fields beyond.